the PFL, the Professional Fighters League, which of course has the TV contract with ESPN, has the seasonal playoff format that's unique, has the $1 million prize. Well, Luke, we also know of their intention next calendar year to launch a pay-per-view division. They had a big day yesterday, Thursday of this week, in terms of breaking news. And I think the quote that jumped out the most from PFL founder Don Davis, who did a ton of interviews, was the quote, "We're open for business for top fighters," end quote. Luke, here's the big news. On a smaller level, Alex Rodriguez, the Yankees great, has added his name to the celebrity list of investors and board of directors, reportedly investing $30 million of his own to join the board. Simultaneously, Waverly Capital has announced a new round of investments with the PFL, which could equal $500 million of new available cash. And Luke, that all ties into the biggest announcement of the day, that when PFL launches this pay-per-view division next year, for the first time in MMA history, they are offering a 50-50 revenue split to the fighters on these pay-per-view cards. So this, in the era of fighter pay talk, and into the idea that anyone not named the UFC, whether you're Bellator, One Championship, PFL, whomever, the idea of potentially becoming a free agent destination home. Luke, how big is this news, the 50-50 pay-per-view split, to the idea next year of PFL potentially signing some giant in their prime names based solely on the money that they're offering here?
It's big. It's really big, and I hope let's spend the appropriate time really breaking this down, because of all the stories we're going to talk about today, I find this one to be by far the most interesting and frankly impactful. I have a lot of mixed feelings about it. There's a lot of things I think about it that are great. There's a lot of things that I have genuine trepidation about. I'm not sure which direction you want to go, but to start off on the positive, the round of financing is enormous. This is clearly a play by like, if you think about it now, PFL, Bellator, and One, all of them make claim to be like the next person or the next entity right behind UFC, but it's actually not so clear. You know, because Bellator has a lot of things going for it. One has a lot of things going for it. PFL, I mean, all of them make a pretty competitive play. So I would actually say, you know, you can make your rankings, but it's hard to know exactly which one really is number two. This is an effort by PFL to make that argument very clear for the rest of us. This is their push to say, right, there's UFC and then there's us and then there's everybody else. That's what they're trying to do here pretty clearly, right?
Before we get into the drawbacks of that, let me just add in the specific Don
I'm not
Davis
saying that's
quote.
a drawback. It's just an ambition goal.
No, I'm saying before we get into the potential drawbacks, you just nailed the key part of this. Does this mean that they are ready to become a legitimate contender for the UFC? Yes, it does mean that.
No. That's not that. Well, okay, let me back up a step. That's not what I'm saying.
Okay,
what I am saying is, listen, the UFC is either at or arguably a monopoly. They can't be touched. You're not going to beat them at their own game unless something catastrophic happens to their business. But what is clear is my point. Bellator has a lot to offer for fans. PFL has a lot to offer for fans. One has a lot. They're all kind of different, right? But it's not clear to me anyway who is the leader among them. What I'm arguing is PFL wants to finish that debate. They want to make sure that they move past all of them. Yes, encroach somewhat potentially on UFC's territory. In fact, they will have to if they want to make waves in pay-per-view. But I think it's for them to put aside any notion that there's any debate about who comes after the UFC. Yeah. They want to assert themselves as the clear number two.
Okay, so you look at this as them becoming, they're showing you their ambition to become the clear number two. See, I'm looking at a little bit further than that. Let me see if your opinion changes after the specific quote that Don Davis gave. He said, "We disrupted, call it the media business, with the league format. We have as good a TV product, not pay-per-view, as the UFC or anybody else. But until today, we've never been in the pay-per-view business. So if you're a pay-per-view fighter, Conor McGregor, or you're Usman, John Jones, or you're people who, like Kayla Harrison next year, you're so good, you're top 2 or 3 or 4 in your weight class, but your economics demand you fight on pay-per-view. Until today, we've never been in that business. We've only been in the media business so far. So starting next year, outside of the league format, we're going to put on 2 super fights." Now, 2 doesn't seem like a lot, Luke, but back to the quote. We're open for business as of today. We're going to do things differently. Just as we disrupted before, fighters will be true economic partners, 50-50. Luke, that sounds to me like they have intention of making a run here. Because right now, look, I was surprised they re-signed with ESPN, the PFL. Because it gives off the indication, ESPN is the exclusive home in what? North America for the UFC. So, UFC, that gives off the indication that ESPN's major leagues and so is the UFC. So it's 1-1 right there. But that PFL's almost the JV team or almost the feeder league, which clear, in some ways they are, as everyone else ends up being to the UFC. But Luke, this to me screams that's not our long-term identity, and we believe our identity can change as early as next year. I mean, having your founder use a quote that has John Jones and Conor McGregor's name in it doesn't mean you get both of those guys or that you're in that space. But that to me is a major claim, like, hey, along with what we're doing on this unique format of the season and the $1 million prize, which could already attract a certain clientele that may be unhappy with their standing in the UFC, we're also going after big fish. Knowing, like you do, Luke, that there's a lot of aging big fish in the UFC right now that still command a top dollar, which is why our first topic about Poirier touched on that whole Nate Diaz one fight left on his UFC deal. Will he go to box Jake Paul? I think PFL's straight up trying to say how we're going to start competing is by going after your unhappy names who feel like they, at this point, they demand to be paid on their name value, and you won't do that. We will. I mean, is that a game changer? That could be, Luke. That to me is them saying, we got balls big enough and the money behind us that we ain't nobody's fucking JV league. We got an ESPN deal and we're doing big money pay-per-views now.
Yes, I think it's that, but I think it's also partly a necessity. Like if they wanted to remain what they are, maybe they could for a long time. But how much can you scale this tournament model to, again, to pass the Bellators, to pass the ones, if that's what you want to do? Like they have turned the tournament model into something pretty clever, pretty interesting, and they've got a good product. But if you scale this, like where does it really go? Like how does this meaningfully improve your market position? It probably doesn't, right? You have to do something else. So they've got this ambition and this monster round of funding to try and not just scale out what they're doing, but scale up. And I think that is it's a very difficult choice, but it's an ambitious one. And let's just say it out loud, dude. MMA needs more of this, right? I lived in a world when I first started watching MMA. I remember Rumble on the Rock. I remember tournaments and they weren't big shows in the sense that we understand them now, but like there were dominant players. Pride has been a dominant player for a long time back in that era. Certainly UFC was a dominant player in the space, but there were a lot of middle players. It seemed that way anyway for, some of these were fly-by-night operations too. But I'm just saying there was more parity in the space. Now, listen, I'm not trying to drag the UFC down, but for the fans, for the fighters in particular, having a promoter in the space that can do pay-per-view, that can reasonably say, hey, we are a pay-per-view company. Now that they have not proven that yet. You can say you're doing pay-per-view. Can you actually meaningfully follow through and have it be successful? Separate conversation, which we'll have. But the general point, BC, is I want to be clear. We need more of this. We need companies who can put together big bank accounts and say, hey, let's try. Let's dare to be great. Let's try to do something in this space that the other promoters are just not either doing or not capable of doing. Whether they'll be successful, I don't know. But I certainly applaud the ambition.
Well, first of all, I hope that Smart Cage can predict whether this has a chance of being successful. I mean, I hope it can do more than order you dinner. But
I can never get over that like they call their cage smart, and I honestly don't know what the fuck it does other than be a cage. But okay.
I mean, like I'm excited about that because like the parallel to the pro wrestling world, which a world I'm kind of out of now, but like is right. Like when there's stretches where it's only WWE and everybody else is a distant second. It's not as fun. The overall product's not as good. Now you got an AEW and other things going on. It kicks it up. But look, there's a difference between where we've been the last few years, which is UFC on top, but then a strong group of number twos, meaning not strong enough where you felt like they could overtake number one, no, but like all have their own niche and strong TV deal and enough names and money where you're like, okay, they're would I like them all to be together in some sort of, utopia, of course, but no, at least, it's fun. But this is the first time I've seen somebody since Strikeforce like show intention that we're trying to make a run. Yes. Now, I don't mean a run to take over the UFC because, they're not even armed for that. You can have all, you need depth to the right. You need a lot. Okay, you need a lot. But they already have a very strong TV placement. They already have very deep funding and celebrity backing and all that for whatever that's worth, as we're finding out now. It could be worth pretty good. They've got the unique setup. They've already got an okay amount of names. But if they could, now they're opening up an area where they could potentially attract those same names that we're talking about cashing themselves out against Jake Paul. Those same names who may say, look, I got, 3 or 4 viable fights left. Do I want to do that in the UFC or do I want to potentially do that in the PFL for a much greater split? Luke, in this day and age of fighter pay, this is a genius move. This is a smart, whether it's all sound and legit and they have a shot or no, this is going after the type of names, just like in pro wrestling, when WCW makes a run at WWF in the 90s, you're going to go after Hogan and these names that can give you legitimacy, hopefully long enough for the rest of your roster to catch up. But dude, this feels like the first time we've had this type of life in another body since Strikeforce and Scott Coker, since they had the Showtime deal, since they put fights on CBS to monster ratings, since they had the EA Sports video game, right? Since they had that heavyweight tournament, at least on paper and how it was announced, that was better than what the UFC had at that moment. Bellator with Scott Coker have had some nice moments since then, but I don't know if I feel like it's as strong of an attempt since Strikeforce. And what did UFC do to Strikeforce back then? They bought them out, right? To eliminate them. I mean, it's different to compare Pride because UFC was still climbing the ladder during those head-to-head battles, but this could get interesting, Luke, if they could get the type of names that we know are difference makers, even if the names are old. These names are potential difference makers.
Well,
the proof will be in the pudding, but does 2 fight cards per year do that? To say we're going to do 2 super fight shows, is that enough, Luke?
To start, maybe more than they need. I mean, we don't know. 2, I would say listen, if they have all that they need, they'll just, again, scale up. If all of a sudden they have this signing bonanza, they can't believe all the names that are coming over, then yes, they will absolutely have more. And so don't worry about that. 2 is probably a fine place to start. But let's be very, very, very clear. And the reason why I think this conversation is so important is because I do take this news seriously. And again, I started off the conversation hopefully in a positive direction, which was we need this. I'm glad PFL is trying. This is something that MMA hasn't had in a while, and I really hope on some level it succeeds. However, we should also not dismiss the difficulties. Now, I don't know what Pride ever did, but I think this would involve them too. But certainly since the end of Pride, which has been some time, no other MMA promoter who has tried pay-per-view has ever broken 100,000 pay-per-view buys, except for Bellator one time. One time they got right at or near the 100,000 mark when they tried it I don't know if that was Scott Coker or Bjorn Rebney. I can't remember anymore. But
was that the Rampage fight?
Yeah, the Rampage fight, I believe, and Tito. I don't even remember anymore. But I remember that they got 100,000 for that. That's usually considered to be something of a break-even point. So understand that basically, since the end of Pride, no other MMA promoter has ever even broken even on an MMA pay-per-view, right? This is what I go back to when I say, well, what would you rather watch? Low-level UFC fights or let's say high-level one, high-level PFL, high-level Bellator fights? What would you rather watch? If your answer is low-level UFC fights, you are not an MMA fan, not much of one, right? There is a real, and Jay Larkin, who, by the way, helped found Showtime Championship Boxing in the 80s and ended up being an executive at the IFL before he tragically passed away from, I think, brain cancer. He noted this, like people think that there are MMA fans. There are not many true MMA fans. There are a shit ton of UFC fans, and there is a real brand cohesion in terms of the fan base to the brand, where it's not just about getting some of those names, which we'll talk about in just a second. One of the most important things that PFL is going to have to overcome is to find a way to grow the MMA fan base. Because if you think you can sell pay-per-views on the kinds of folks who love all different kinds of MMA and that you can make a lot of money from that, you are very mistaken. You have to pull in UFC fans. Otherwise, this whole thing is DOA.
Yeah, no doubt. And I'm not saying like it's easy to make a run at number one, whether it's, pro wrestling or MMA. It's not. And I'm not even imagining a world if PFL did over exceed, the expectations of what 2023 can look like. They're still not competing on a dollar for dollar, day for day. But, those comments from the founder was that there's two companies now starting next year. So it shows their intention. If they could offer a second opportunity in the negotiation scale, like I don't think we're going to see a union of MMA fighters tomorrow and everybody get what they deserve, but a legitimate second suitor that's potentially throwing around big money. But look, obviously it comes down to the dollars and cents. Like, you don't have an offer until you have one, then it's legit. Are they offering huge fight purses, or are they only offering the potential of the 50-50 split, which is great when it sells, but you got to make sure you have the right fights, the right card, the right presentation so that it will sell, so the fighters can make the money that they're being promised here. I don't know specifics beyond what he said with the 50-50 split, but do they need to be offering more than that for this to become a legitimate free agent destination for the top names?
Well, they have to still make money on it, right? They can't, like 50-50 seems like it sounds fair. It's what a lot of boxing promoters do, right? It's a 50-50 split with the talent. So it just seems like a place where you can still make some money and you can make your premium talent a lot happier by virtue of the, at least in theory, the elevated purse levels. But, it's a clear pitch also because PFL has for a long time prided itself on being a very pro fighter league. That's one thing that they've been high on. And then two, they would need to offer this much before losing money. Like how much can we give up as a way to like incentivize people to come over? This is basically how much they can give up before it becomes, a losing proposition. But we should game this out here a little bit, BC, because here is the reality. There are a certain set of stars where being, let's say Nate Diaz being in the UFC and fighting Conor and then the UFC promoting this is going to make it, they are a helpful entity in that way. But it is also true that if Nate Diaz fought Conor without the help of the UFC, how much would they sell? They would still sell an absolute metric ton, right? The UFC in that sense is valuable, but hardly essential. However, there is another tier of fighters, and this is the majority of them who you see on pay-per-view, who, yes, they could sell a fair amount without the help of the UFC, but that's where the partnership with the UFC, and this is an argument Dana has made, and he's right, that's where the fighter brings some popularity, the UFC as a brand brings some awareness, right, and some connections, and then the two together become a more powerful force than if they were disaggregated. Now you have to ask a question. How many of those guys are you going to be able to get, number one, if you're PFL, and then what can they sell on their own in such a way where it makes sense for them to not partner with the UFC because you'd be getting a greater share of the PFL, but probably a much lower buy rate overall. Would you still make more by being with the UFC? See, here's the end of the day, BC, what the PFL has to figure out a way to do. You can offer 50-50, but what does that mean? If that doesn't mean in the end that you actually get more money than you would be at the UFC, then this effort goes nowhere. They have to sell enough where not partnering with the UFC, even if the buy rates are lower, still gets them more by virtue of the cut that they're getting.